Today's story opens in one of the most intimidating places on Earth. It's not a haunted house or a Warzone, it's a hole in the ground. But not just any hole. This one is called Bushman's Hole. From above, it doesn't look like much. Located in the middle of a remote game farm in South Africa, this seemingly ordinary crater blends into the rugged landscape. But if you follow a dusty trail to the middle of that crater, you'll find a puddle. That's what it looks like anyway. A puddle. Innocent. Still. But if you step into it, you're no longer in South Africa. You're in space. Or at least, that's what divers say. Bushman's Holier Boesmansgat, as it's locally known, is the deepest freshwater cave in the world, descending to a chilling 900 feet. And for adrenaline junkies like young South African Dion Dreyer, that's not a warning, it's an invitation. By the age of 20, Dion had lived fast. Racing cars, building bikes, and now, cave diving. It was the perfect mix of danger and thrill, and he'd already logged 200 dives. So when a group of divers invited him to join an expedition over his Christmas break in 1994, he didn't hesitate. They were aiming for 492 feet, barely past halfway, but still deeper than most people ever dare to go. They needed one more diver. Dion was in. At first, everything went smoothly. The descent was beautiful, almost surreal. On the way back up, Dion's dive buddy turned around to check on him. Dion flashed the OK signal and kept swimming with his light cutting through the darkness. But then, he was gone. Only moments later, the same diver looked back again, and Dion had vanished. What he saw instead was Dion's flashlight, still attached to him, drifting deeper and deeper. The diver tried to chase him down, but the realization hit hard. Diving after him would be suicide. When they resurfaced, they told Dion's family what they believed had happened. Most likely, Dion had suffered a deep water blackout, a sudden and silent loss of consciousness caused by pressure or lack of oxygen. And now, he was resting at the bottom of Bushman's Hole. Rescue teams sent a robot down to locate Dion's body, but the cave swallowed it up. The only thing they ever found was his helmet. 10 years passed. Then came Dave Shaw. At 50 years old, Dave was no stranger to risk. A highly accomplished technical diver, he wasn't content with safe dives in coral reefs or shipwrecks. He went where others wouldn't. In 2004, he made a record-setting dive to over 800 feet inside Bushman's Hole, becoming only the third person in history to reach those depths. But what he found that day changed everything. As Dave touched down on the cave's sloping, muddy floor, he swept his light across the bottom and froze. There, floating eerily still, arms extended as if reaching for the surface, was a body. Dion. His skull and hands were partially skeletonized, but the rest of him was surprisingly intact. His wetsuit and tanks had preserved most of his body mass. And Dave, moved by the discovery, wanted to do something no one else had dared. He wanted to bring Dion home. At the surface, Dave made a decision. He called Dion's parents and told them, "I'm going back. I'm going to retrieve your son." For Dion's family, it was like a ghost knocking at the door. After 10 years of grief, they were finally being offered closure, the chance to bury their son, to say goodbye. The recovery mission was scheduled for the 8th of January, 2005. It was planned with military precision. A team of divers would form a vertical relay chain, each spaced 100 feet apart. Dave would go all the way down, secure Dion's body in a specially designed bag, and pass him up from diver to diver, hand over hand, until he reached the surface. At 6:13 a.m., Dave entered the water. His helmet had a camera, and he carried everything he needed. He descended faster than expected, reaching Dion's body in record time. He got to work. He pulled out the bag. He began maneuvering Dion. But almost immediately, something went wrong. Dave realized Dion was still tangled on something, likely his tank snagged on debris. Dave pulled, twisted, tried to free him, but it wasn't working. And then, silence. The diver stationed 100 feet above Dave stared down into the black. Dave's flashlight wasn't moving. That's when panic began creeping in. He descended to try and help. But on his way down, he heard a strange, fizzing sound, looked at his wristband, saw that one of his gauges had broken. Critical equipment failure. If he continued, he could die too. So, with a heavy heart, he turned around and began the long ascent. Because of decompression requirements, he couldn't go straight to the surface. So instead, he used a grease pen and wrote a note on a slate board. "Dave's not coming back." That message was passed like a telegram diver to diver until it reached the top. On land, Dion's parents were waiting. When someone finally read the slate out loud, there was a moment of full 30 seconds where no one spoke. Then Dion's parents broke down. Not only had they lost their son again, now they had to live with the guilt that another man had died trying to bring him home. By nightfall, the rest of the divers had made it safely out. But Dave Shaw remained at the bottom of Bushman's Hole entangled with the very body he'd sworn to recover. It seemed their fate was sealed together. But then something happened no one expected. Over the next few days, no one had the strength to go back in. The loss of Dave Shaw cast a heavy shadow over the entire diving community. Not only had one of the most experienced cave divers in the world died, but he'd done so trying to recover the body of another diver lost a decade earlier. And now, both of them were trapped 900 feet beneath the cold, crushing blackness of Bushman's Hole. The team decided not to touch the equipment. Everything ropes, lines, and gear would remain in place. It felt wrong to disturb it. Instead, they gathered at the rim of the crater and sang "Amazing Grace," their voices echoing into the abyss. But then, as they began pulling up the lines for inspection, something strange happened. Bubbles. Lots of them. The water below suddenly came alive with a fizzing trail of air. The divers leaned in, watching closely. And then, emerging from the depths like something out of a ghost story, came two bodies, side by side, tangled together. Dion Dreyer and Dave Shaw. In death, Dave had accomplished what no one thought possible. He had freed Dion from the cave's grip. Somehow, during his final moments, Dave had managed to loosen whatever was holding Dion's body down. And when the line was pulled, both were released from the depths and rose to the surface. The cave had let them go. The recovery team moved quickly. The bodies were carefully pulled from the water. Despite the conditions, Dave's helmet camera was still intact. Miraculously, it had recorded everything right up to his last breath. Authorities took the footage and analyzed it frame by frame. At first, the video showed exactly what was expected: Dave descending, finding Dion's body, trying to free it. But then things got chaotic. The camera picked up Dave's heavy breathing. The silt on the cave floor began to stir. Visibility dropped to near zero, and just as the dust cleared, it became horrifyingly clear what had happened. Dion's body had somehow come loose. No longer anchored, it was now free-floating in the water and falling apart. His suit had preserved his frame, but his remains had become extremely fragile. As Dave tried to move him, Dion's body literally began disintegrating in his hands. The visibility worsened. Mud, silt, darkness. And then, the camera showed something else. Dave was tangled. One of the lines had looped around his gear and Dion's tanks had become his anchor. Dave switched focus. He started tugging on the line, trying to free himself. His breathing turned desperate short gasps through the regulator. Then, silence. A terrifying pause. Narcosis. The video suggested that Dave had succumbed to nitrogen narcosis, a condition where the brain, deprived of oxygen and overwhelmed by pressure, begins to misfire like being drunk underwater. Divers lose clarity. They lose judgment. Dave pulled out a pair of scissors, but he didn't use them. He just held them. Confused, disoriented. Then he turned from Dion and tried to move toward the ascent route, but his movements were sluggish. He slowed. His breathing grew fainter. And then, he stopped. That was the end of the footage. 10 days later, Dion's parents stood inside a morgue. For the first time in 10 years, they were going to see their son again. It didn't matter that his body was in poor condition. That didn't faze them. For a grieving parent, closure isn't about pristine final moments. It's about something to hold on to. And what they saw caught them off guard in a way no one expected. He was wearing underwear they recognized. A pair of jockey briefs they had bought him years ago. It was a small, almost absurd detail, but to them, it mattered. It was proof. It was real. Their son, still their boy. Somehow, even after death, there was still a connection. And as odd as it sounds, that underwear allowed them to feel like they were saying goodbye to the same kid they'd lost 10 years earlier. But not every diving story ends in closure. Let's jump forward to 2022, this time on the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. It's 4 a.m. on the 25th of February. A man named Christopher Boudram wakes up in his modest home in the town of Point Pierre. His wife is still asleep. Quietly, he steps into the next room, does his usual morning workout, and makes himself breakfast. By 5:30, he's out the door, keys in hand, heading to work. Christopher is a professional commercial diver with over a decade of experience. His job? Underwater pipeline maintenance. He works for a company called Perea Fuel, and lately, he's been fortunate his job site is just a few minutes from home. On this day, he's been assigned a maintenance task on a particular pipe, berth number 6. This pipeline hasn't been active since 2018. It's just been sitting idle beneath the water. But now, Perea wants to bring it back online. So Christopher and 4 colleagues are tasked with reactivating it. But berth 6 isn't like the other pipes. It's sealed. The vertical section near the shore has been plugged for years using a massive inflatable cork. Think of it like shoving an air mattress into a wine bottle. Over that cork, the company had placed something called a habitat, basically an upside-down bucket that traps air and creates a dry work area underwater. Here's how it works. The divers swim down, enter the habitat, climb onto a small platform, remove their gear, and work in this little underwater air pocket. It's weird. It's claustrophobic. But it works. On this particular morning, Christopher is joined by 4 other men. Kazim Ali Jr., Isef Henry, Vizal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar. They all know each other well. This isn't their first dive together. Once they get their gear ready, they board a small boat and make their way out to sea hovering above the submerged habitat. One by one, they dive in, slipping under the rim of the upside-down bucket and into the tight, breathless chamber above the sealed pipe. They take off their gear. The job is simple. Deflate the cork using a lever inside the pipe. Only, the lever is jammed. They need a wrench. So Kazim suits back up and swims to the surface. He grabs the tool, dives again, and re-enters the habitat. He hands the wrench to one of the men inside. They twist the lever. And that's when everything goes catastrophically wrong. The moment the plug deflates, it's like the laws of physics implode. There's a rapid shift in pressure. The habitat had been holding high-pressure air, and now it's suddenly connected to an empty 1,200-foot pipe. The result is explosive. The pipe becomes a vacuum. Everything inside the habitat gear, tools, and all 5 minis sucked into the pipe. Feet first. The moment that vacuum took hold, the inside of the habitat turned into a nightmare. The 5 divers Christopher, Kazim, Isef, Vizal, and Rishi were yanked off their feet with the force of a jet engine. They had no time to react, no time to grab air tanks, no time to brace themselves. They were violently pulled into the pipe, feet first, their bodies slamming into one another, equipment crashing into them, seawater rushing in behind them. They were being dragged into total darkness down the vertical shaft of the pipeline, around the bend, and then shot like bullets through a 1,200-foot-long G tunnel that ran along the seafloor. This section of pipe was only about 2.5 feet wide, just wide enough for their shoulders to squeeze through. They were trapped in a narrow metal coffin, shooting through blackness, on a breath hold. No light, no orientation, just darkness, water, and terror. But somehow, they survived the ride. Eventually, the pressure inside the pipe equalized. The sucking force stopped. The seawater stopped pouring in. Everything settled into a chilling silence. And by some miracle, the 5 men came to rest in a slightly elevated section of the horizontal pipeline just high enough for a small pocket of air to form. Gasping, coughing, terrified, the men found themselves crammed together inside this tiny bubble, barely able to breathe. We know all of this because one of their body-worn cameras was still recording. Though the footage shows nothing but black, the audio captures the chaos, the screams, the desperation. In those first moments they were panicking, totally disoriented. But eventually they realized they were all alive. And that air pocket? It gave them one shot at survival. They needed to find a way back. Christopher Boudram was the closest to the pipe's origin, the vertical shaft near shore. If there was any hope of escape, it was through that way. So he told the others to calm down and come up with a plan. It was difficult to move. Every inch was a battle. Their injuries were severe broken bones, torn muscles, bruises from the high-speed impact. But they managed to form a human chain, each man placing his feet on the shoulders of the one below him. Using only their heels, they began inching backwards, retracing the path they'd just been sucked through. But then, they hit water. A completely submerged section of the pipe. No one knew how long it stretched. It could be 10 feet, it could be 100. Once you go in, you either find another air pocket or you drown. Christopher and Vizelle Kerben were the only two who were willing and able to take the risk. The others, too injured or too terrified, stayed behind in the air pocket, screaming for their friends not to leave. But the two men had made up their minds. Somebody had to get help. And that meant pushing forward into total darkness, on a breath hold, with no idea if they'd ever reach the surface again. Christopher led the way. By sheer luck, the first flooded stretch was short. They emerged on the other side coughing, choking, but alive, and found another air pocket. But something even more miraculous happened there. Christopher reached above his head and felt something solid. 2 scuba tanks. Incredibly, they had been pulled into the pipe with them. Christopher managed to wedge one tank down to Vizelle. They both had regulators, the mouthpieces that deliver air, but because of how narrow the pipe was, they had to awkwardly pin the tanks above their heads while gripping the mouthpieces in their teeth. It was far from ideal, but it meant one thing. They could now dive through much longer flooded sections. And that's exactly what they did. They inched forward for hours, blindly navigating water-filled segments of the pipe, hoping they wouldn't run out of air or lose their grip on the mouthpieces. They had no idea how much air was left in the tanks. No clue if they were heading in the right direction, but they kept going. Finally, they reached another air pocket. But something was wrong. Vizelle, the diver behind Christopher, began to panic. He started yelling, begging Christopher to stop and wait. He had no reason, no plan, just needed everything to stop. Christopher hesitated. He could still hear the others, Kazim, Isif, and Risha screaming way back down the pipe. Time was running out. He tried to convince Vizelle to keep going, but when it was clear that Vizelle couldn't push forward, Christopher made a decision. He whispered, "I'll go alone. I'll get help. I'll come back." And then, he moved on. Christopher pushed the tank above his head, clenched the mouthpiece between his teeth, and entered what would be the final flooded section of pipe. He had no idea how long it was. He just swam. And then he hit the vertical shaft. The pipe was going up. He was almost there. He fought his way to the top of that vertical section and surfaced inside the habitat. But he wasn't out yet. The water level wasn't high enough for him to pull himself out. He was trapped like a man stuck at the bottom of a well. But then he felt something brush his hand, a chain, dangling from above. He grabbed it and held on. Eventually, 2 rescue divers entered the habitat and spotted him. They pulled him out of the pipe and brought him to the surface. Christopher was saved, but his mind was somewhere else. The moment he hit dry land, he saw the chaos emergency response teams, coast guards, helicopters, people swarming. He didn't care. He ran straight to the nearest official and screamed, "They're still alive! All 4 of them! I heard them! They're banging on the pipe! You have to go get them!" But no one moved. Paria Fuel and local authorities deemed the situation too dangerous. They refused to send divers into the pipeline. Christopher, devastated, tried to jump back into the water himself, but they stopped him. Even at the hospital, after being rushed to intensive care, he tried to check himself out to return to the site. Again, they stopped him. For 2 agonizing days, the other 4 divers remained inside the pipe, banging, screaming, waiting. No one came. On the 27th of February, the banging stopped. All 4 men were dead. They likely suffocated, or drowned trying to escape, or succumbed to their injuries in the pipe's unbearable confines. Their bodies were recovered over the next few days, 3 on the 28th of February, the last on the 3rd of March. A full investigation is still ongoing. But many, including Christopher, believe those men could have been saved if someone had acted sooner. And now, only one thing remains from the horror in that pipe. The final footage from Kazim's body camera. It starts off normal Kazim inside the habitat, handing off the wrench. Everything seems fine. Then, in a flash it cuts to black. No fade. No warning. Just gone. That's how fast the pipe claimed them. No time to scream. No time to think. Just darkness. Forever.